Welcome back to the Legal Weekly Wine, where we discuss the week's hottest legal topics. We are in the week of September, and I have to get this right, of September 17th. And the reason I say that specifically, Dr. Vile's giving me the heads up, is because it's Constitution Week. And we, especially at the Weekly Wine, want to celebrate Constitution Week because we have our constitutional scholar with us. So that's the special edition today. We are going to be finding out everything you ever wanted to know about the Constitutional Convention, including who was there, when it was, why it happened, what amendments were proposed, and many more questions. If you ever were interested, or even if you didn't think you were, stay tuned because this is actually fairly interesting stuff. I'm Virginia Tehrani. I'm with Tehrani Law LLC because you never need a lawyer till you do. And joining me as our regular guest is Dr. John Vile. He is with the Middle Tennessee State University Honors College as the dean. He's a longstanding political science professor and scholar, and especially does research and has expertise in the Constitution, the Constitutional Convention, the amending process, the list goes on. Most of the American symbols, constitutional law, the Fourth Amendment, the First Amendment, and we are privileged to have you here. Thanks for joining us, Dr. Vile.
It's a pleasure. Constitution Week.
Yeah, I know that it's one of your favorite weeks of the entire year. It
is. I actually got to speak at a community college on Monday on the Electoral College. I was on a panel.
Okay.
And then yesterday, all state colleges, I don't know how many people know this, but all state colleges and universities, as of about 10 years ago, are required to celebrate Constitution Week.
Oh.
And some of us take that requirement not simply as a requirement, but as something really exciting to do. So we always have, among other things, a reading of the Constitution outside of the Honors College.
Nice.
Our president, Dr. McPhee, our president, joined us yesterday.
Aww.
But I got out-topped by the business dean when they did theirs. They had an associate dean come and sing the preamble. So next year, we did at Saturday's football game where we beat up on Murray State. We did have one of our freshman Buchanan students sing the national anthem. When she told me she was going to do it a cappella, my first thought was, does that mean she can't carry a tune?
Oh, no.
But she did. I had actually heard her carry a tune. I had never heard anything at that range. And she belted it out. It just did a magnificent job.
Oh, amazing.
If somebody goes to the MTSU Honors website, somewhere there they can find her singing the national anthem. And again, she just did a wonderful job for us.
Wow, well, that's incredible. And as I also understand it, the Honors College is doing another special this week. I don't know if it just happened to fall on Constitution Week or if it was already pre-scheduled for its 50th reunion.
We are. That's right. The Honors, it was actually founded as a program. Dr. June McCash, who was one of your professors, if I remember correctly, a French professor, started the program back in 1973. So we are celebrating 50 years, have a big banquet planned and some outside speakers and a lot of guests, and we are looking forward to it. And Monday on our campus, we had a panel with former U.S. Senator from Tennessee, Bob Corker, and Representative Jim Cooper, who basically did it was very fascinating because it used to be you could be on other sides of the aisle and you would still converse and have friendships. And I think for the Trump generation, there were some in the audience who had never seen a Republican and a Democrat both on the same stage who were complementary toward one another,
right,
and clearly were working toward common goals. And I think I was not the one who invited them, but we have the American Democracy Project, our chapter of that housed in the Honors College, and Dr. Evans, who heads that up, invited our speakers, and it went on a good time, as did the panel that I was on at Columbia State University.
Wonderful. Well, that's very exciting. And I want to talk about your books. But before we get to that, with the weekly
Can
wine.
I say one other thing?
Well, if you're that excited, then absolutely.
I am. Okay, Saturday. I mean, what college professor gets a chance to be in a parade other than, if you were in the band in high school, which I was. But Saturday, God willing, and the creeks don't rise, I'm going to be in a 1969 Stingray red Corvette.
Wow.
In a parade in Murfreesboro, Tennessee. So I'm sure many of your viewers are going to want to get on a plane immediately.
Everybody
and head down and see this.
I mean, it is happy hour on Friday, so you have time. We have time to get there. Well, I hope some people take some pictures. I would love to include them on our website and social media posts as to what the Legal Weekly Wine hosts are up to every week. Okay, so we're going to do the wine. I have gone back to one of the first wines that we did on the show, which is a Commendador. And it is a red wine from the Mariah Vineyards out in Manassas, Virginia. A lovely, beautiful, silky wine that feels like it goes with anything or just plain. So cheers. I believe you actually have something other than water, maybe a soda.
I do. This is Pepsi. I forget what their slogan is. But whatever it is.
Well, it's good because we're equal opportunity. We had a Coca-Cola a couple weeks ago, so now we have Pepsi.
Yes.
It's good. We're not promoting one or the other. And cheers and happy hour.
Trying to remember which one, when Kennedy took his trip to Russia, Nixon as vice president visited Russia. And he was there, among other things, to promote this was the so-called kitchen debate. And so it was held, I think it was like a World's Fair or something being held there. And he was at the American exhibit on a modern kitchen. And so he was touting all the advantages of capitalism so that people had refrigerators and dishwashers and this sort of thing. Nice. But he also, I can't remember whether it was one or both that he was promoting there in any event.
Very interesting.
Vice presidents have it rough sometimes.
They really do. Yeah. Just terrible. And I thought you were going to mention the one, was it Kennedy who said, I am a jelly donut, speaking in the language?
There's controversy about that. It was when he went to West Berlin, he said, Ich bin ein Berländer. And some say that there was a jelly donut at the time that was called the Berländer. So I'm not sure about the accuracy of that or not. I know we did have, when we were in Lake Charles, Louisiana, the reports were that one of the attorneys had gone to a meeting in France and announced that he was an avocado instead of an advocate, which is fairly easy to
instead of an avocado.
Yes.
I had my boyfriend in college, you'll remember this, went to France, went to England and then visited me in France for a quick minute while I was doing a study abroad. And he kept saying that people would approach him and he would say, "No parlez Francois. No parlez Francois." And I was like, yeah, I think they're going to know you don't speak French when you're saying you don't speak Francois, which is a male's name, not... Yeah, I don't think it'll be an issue. So I believe, and speaking of France, and you are the expert. Is there anything from France that made it into the Constitution or that helped lead to provisions? I know we're heavily influenced from England, since that's where most of the immigrants came from. But I believe, at least, and maybe this is more towards once the presidency began, I know that Thomas Jefferson spent a lot of time in France. And I'm wondering...
That was not at the convention.
Correct. He was not at the convention.
Adams. Adams was in England or Great Britain, and he was a diplomat to France.
So did anything from France make it there, or what other influences are we looking at?
Might have been some possible influence of Rousseau on many of the founders, not nearly as great, most of them think, as John Locke, who was an English philosopher, but probably the French philosopher who had the greatest indirect influence would have been the Baron de Montesquieu. He had written a huge book called The Spirit of the Laws, and is usually credited with the idea of separation of powers. It wasn't necessarily unique to him, but he certainly emphasized it quite a bit. So, and in fact, there's quite a bit of discussion of Montesquieu in the Federalist Papers, which were a series of essays written in support of the Constitution after it was signed.
By Benjamin Franklin?
No.
Or is that just a rumor?
No. The Federalist Papers were they were written under the name of Publius, which was the name of a Roman statesman. It's very common at that time, to sign something as Caesar or Cromwell or Publius or whatever. And the Federalist Papers were the greatest number of essays were written by Alexander Hamilton, who had not actually spent that much time at the convention, maybe a month out of the, May 15th through September 17th period. Madison, I think, wrote the most brilliant essays. And then there's about 5 or 6 of them that were written by John Jay, primarily on the diplomatic aspects. Jay had not attended the Constitutional Convention, but obviously knew a bit about the deliberations.
So who was there? If we're missing John Jay, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison.
No. James Madison was there. John Adams.
John Adams. Okay.
Yeah.
Sorry, I swapped them. John Adams.
Yeah, no, that's fine.
So Madison was there. Who else was there?
Well, I mean, there were a total of 55 delegates from all the states except Rhode Island. So, 12 of the 13 states had delegates there. Madison was among the most influential. James Wilson of Pennsylvania was very influential. Gouverneur Morris, who was representing Pennsylvania but also could have claimed New York, was the one who spoke the most. Roger Sherman of Connecticut. Madison's often called the father of the Constitution. Mm-hmm. That's not quite right. But if you go head to head in what Madison wanted and got and what Sherman wanted and got, they were about equal. Sherman might have even bested him on that. George Washington, of course, was there. He was elected as chair of the convention. He didn't say very much. He didn't generally say a lot. On the other hand, he might not have considered it appropriate as someone who was presiding. And again, Edmund Rand, you go sort of state by state. Most of the, Mr. Jefferson later referred to it as an assembly of demigods. That's not quite accurate. There were some people there who didn't particularly, and there were some, to take an example, George Wythe was there for about a week. His wife was deathly ill and he returned home. Wythe was the first law professor in the United States from Virginia. George Mason was there. He ended up being one of 3 individuals who did not sign the Constitution because it did not contain at that time a Bill of Rights. And he left pretty discouraged, I think, of the convention, although it came around a little bit after the Bill of Rights was adopted. Benjamin Franklin was there. He was the oldest member. I believe he was 81 at the time. He seems to have been as useful, maybe for what he did behind the scenes as he did at the convention. He was always the one when things got, who would propose a compromise or tell a funny story or make a reference to something in the Bible that sort of brought people together. But it was a serious group of people. We forget. So, we declare our independence, 1776. The war's over, 1781. In the interim, we adopt the Articles of Confederation, which are basically almost close to a treaty, or was sometimes called a League of Friendship. You had a single branch of government, Congress, which was unicameral, a single House of Congress. Each state was represented equally. It had very limited powers. It is, we call it the Articles of Confederation because structurally it resembles what we today call a confederal government, which is to say, when sovereignty was divided between what we would call the national government and the states, primary powers continued to rest in the states. The centrifugal forces were greater than the centripetal forces, if you will. And as a consequence, Congress, for example, had no power over interstate commerce. Congress did not print a common currency. And when it came to foreign affairs, generally the 13 states had it together, but they ended up, it was common for states to tax one another. Customs duties were the primary taxes of the time. And it was said that New Jersey was like a cast with a tap on each end, to the north, New York was taxing it, and to the south, I guess it would have been Pennsylvania or, one of those states.
Well, it almost sounds like it was really set up as if they were competing countries rather than what we know as the states today. It was set up more like European countries.
Again, a league of friendship. There's still textual ambiguity. If you read the Declaration of Independence, were they declaring? Were 13 of them independently claiming independence, or were they doing it together? I think they were doing it together, but there's enough ambiguity there that yes, in some ways it might be closer today to today's, or let's go back to 20 years ago, what NATO would have been like. You have states basically allied for purposes of self-defense, but not a lot of, and some people, by the way, think we should go back to that, think that, and I used to think so until I started reading articles like the one in this last month's Atlantic that asked, is Tennessee democratic any longer? and we're far ahead, I think, in democracy in many other states. But Madison was one actually who tended to argue that if we had a central government over a larger area, it would be less likely to divide into factions. Not to divide into factions. It would be less likely that any single faction would control.
Interesting.
And so he argued, and this was, by the way, you mentioned France. Montesquieu had argued that Republican government was only possible in small states, and Madison and others had to make the argument that no, we can consolidate isn't quite the word, because the framers did not adopt a unitary system. In a unitary system, you don't have sovereign states. You don't have states with their own constitutions, their own designated boundaries. So we didn't go to what the British have, unitary system, but we decided ultimately that the government under the Articles was inadequate, and we needed a more centralized government than that. And
okay, so, I'm going to pause. I'm going to pause you because I'm not sure how many of our listeners, and I'll admit for me, it's been quite a hot minute since I studied the actual beginning of the Constitution. But especially in this day and age, in looking back and in reviewing governments, the Articles of Confederation that you're talking about sound an awful lot like, and forgive me for me sounding naive, but I want to make sure we clarify this point. How is that different? I know they're different documents than the Articles of the Confederacy.
No.
But were they based on each other where the Confederate states were trying to complement it?
Well, the Confederacy, is an example of a confederal government.
Okay.
But, and we still have the argument, what was the Civil War fought over? Was it fought, most Southerners today want to say it was states' rights. Others say, well, slavery wasn't, the primary difference between northern and southern states had to do with slavery. So that was the underlying issue. But although it came closer to a confederal than a federal government, the Confederate Constitution was actually pretty much word for word the U.S. Constitution with some minor change. Well, one is not a minor change. There were several explicit mentions of slavery. Okay. In the U.S. Constitution, they always use euphemisms, such other persons not taxed or that sort of thing. So it recognized slavery. It included, by the way, a reference to God, which should alert people that just because a document does or does not mention God doesn't necessarily mean that God ordered it. It had if I remember correctly, there was a 6-year term for the president who was not electable. And there were a few other, I believe there was an item veto, although I'm not sure that it was ever exercised, but I believe the president had an item veto. And there were a few other differences, but basically it was the U.S. Constitution as members of the South had come to interpret it in the first 100 years or so.
Okay. So now and going back to then the revolutionary time and the beginnings of the government, why did they feel there was a need to change from this Articles of Confederation to what we know as the U.S. Constitution?
Good. Well, again, part of it was there was a perceived inadequacy in Congress. The other thing we didn't mention, in a confederal government, as I understand it, operate directly on individuals. It has to operate through the states. So rather than have a national income tax, for example, and we didn't get that in the U.S. Constitution for many years later, but under the original Constitution, under the Articles, the only way you could get taxes was to requisition the states, who would then raise the money for you. And the same thing was true of raising an army. If you needed an army of, 200,000 people, you might ask New York for 20,000 and Virginia for 30,000. Okay. But you would be dependent on them actually raising the troops and sending them on your behalf. So Congress did not have the power to tax and spend like our current Congress. And again, they had no control over interstate or foreign commerce. So states literally, and this goes back to, why I said it was like NATO maybe 20 years ago, England could put a tariff on goods coming from France and vice versa. Well, so too could New York and New Jersey and Pennsylvania and all the other states. Sure. Now, the other issue was that between the time that there were two meetings that preceded the convention. One was a meeting of some delegates at Mount Vernon, delegates from Maryland and Virginia, actually. They were having disputes over navigation on the Potomac River. And it wasn't clear, who had what authority. So they met and worked it out. And then the clever ones among them said, well, why don't we call a larger convention to deal with commerce in general? And that was the so-called Annapolis Convention. And only 5 states showed up. But apparently Hamilton and Madison, who both attended, said, let's use this to call for a constitutional convention, which they did. And that's the convention that began in May of 1787 and lasted through September 17th of that year.
Okay, now while that was going on in 1787, what was happening with the presidency? What about George Washington?
Okay. Now hold on. There was no president, but let's go back. So I said the other problem with the Articles of Confederation is partly because the national government had to requisition states. If there was a rebellion within a state, if a state was threatened by anarchy, it wasn't clear that the national government could sufficiently intervene. And so what happened, there was a taxpayer revolt called Shays' Rebellion in Massachusetts between the meeting of the Annapolis Convention and the Constitutional Convention. And Congress had to go through all kinds of subterfuges. If I remember correctly, they appropriated money to deal with possible Native American uprisings, which in fact was designed to try to help Massachusetts to keep it from the government from being overthrown. So that impetus seems to be one of the, and just generally the economy wasn't doing well. America was not, when American diplomats went abroad, nobody could be sure that they were speaking for all 13 former colonies.
Okay.
And so they didn't, and a lot of people were just, they were almost like vultures waiting on the sidelines. The European, Britain wanted its colonies back. France and Spain were waiting in the wings. And so a lot of the impetus, I think, from the convention came from people who had been abroad and said, we just don't get the same kind of respect that other governments do.
Okay. So,
but no presidents. Okay, but back up a minute. So no presidency in the Articles. In the Articles, Congress reigned supreme, only it wasn't supreme.
It was the only
powers it had were conducted basically by Congress, and I think there was technically a president of the Congress, if somebody that they would elect to lead them. I believe a man named Hanson is sometimes credited as being the first president of the United States, but he wasn't a president with the same kind of independent, separated powers that our president has today.
Now, and speaking of all of this, one of your books, I think it is the one on the Constitutional Convention, has the cover with this amazing photograph of a painting that seems very ingrained, at least in my memory.
Is this it?
That is one of them, though there's the other one.
This is, I got to mention, okay, you brought it up. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Constitutional Convention of 1787, a comprehensive encyclopedia of America's founding. The other one, which is that's 2 volumes. That's particularly great if you teach American history. But if you just want a quick read, I have a short volume called The Writing and Ratification of the U.S. Constitution. And I'm trying to remember, I believe that's Cleo, who is the muse of history, maybe telling virtue or, I don't remember, virtue or wisdom, in founding a new country.
Isn't there another? Maybe it's with the Declaration of Independence, where Washington is standing all regally with his arm out, and the group of what seems to be Benjamin Franklin and others. Is that?
Well, now, okay, it probably would have been Hancock, because Washington was actually out in the field when the Declaration of Independence was signed. I do have, that was the tie that I wore on Constitution Day. Today, I'm back to my Philadelphia tie, which comes in either a yellow or a blue.
Do you have both?
It has my preferred method of communication, the quill pen.
Nice. Very nice. I would ask if you have one on your desk, but you might just not know it with as many things are on your desk.
That is very true.
Okay, so
I do have a nice statue of Mr. Jefferson on my desk, the author of primary author of the Declaration of Independence.
Which would be hard to miss, a statue.
Yes, it would.
It would be. With him gone and John Adams.
Yes.
How did they even vote? Because again, in my little layperson's mind, even though I studied government, I think it's just naturally we keep having these pictures of, well, it was all the first presidents who clearly met. They're the ones who counted the first presidents and Benjamin Franklin and
he wasn't the president.
I know he wasn't, but these are the men that I picture, clearly wrongly so, but I think we're so entrenched on who were the first presidents that at least I end up trying to associate them still with the Constitution.
Well, the only two future presidents who were there were George Washington and James Madison.
Okay.
And both were highly influential. Madison much more in, basically so let's go back to your question. How did they vote? Under the Articles of Confederation, each state was equally represented. They could have like 2 to 7 delegates, but they only had one vote. They operated on that same principle at the Constitutional Convention. So typically you'll see a vote that'll say like 11 to 1 or 5 to 6, meaning, 5 for it, 6 against it. One isn't there. One never shows up. Maybe the other is divided or isn't there yet.
But that's per state that it's talking about of the people in the state.
Each state. And when they say in the end, when the Constitution was sent to the people, to the states for ratification, it was said that it was adopted unanimously by the states present. And that's because, and actually, that's even tricky because Virginia, I believe there were 5 remaining delegates and 2 of them, Randolph and Mason, refused to sign. But there were still 3 who did. New York, that's out of 2 or 3. Out of 3 delegates, only 1 was left. So Hamilton had to sign on behalf of himself rather than on behalf of the entire state. But you had very articulate people, and basically what happened, the convention was called. If you read the resolution, it was basically called to revise and enlarge the existing Articles of Confederation. And I think most delegates probably arrived thinking, okay, we need to give some greater powers to Congress.
Sure.
What happened is the Virginia delegation, I believe the first outside delegate to arrive at the convention was James Madison. And most of the other delegation came fairly quickly. And what Madison did is, it seems primarily Madison, there were others in the Virginia delegation, but early in the convention, they introduced what's known as the Virginia Plan. And it did not meet the terms of the convention. It did not revise and enlarge. It basically said, this system isn't going to work. We're going to propose something new.
It replaced it.
Right. So you start with, you move eventually, and not all of this was in the original Virginia Plan, but you basically move from a confederal government to what we today call a federal government. You move from one independent branch of government to 3 branches, legislative, executive, and judicial. You move from a one-house Congress where each state has a single vote to a 2-house Congress where under the original plan, states in both houses would have been represented according to population. Now that changes. They debate the Virginia plan for 2 or 3 weeks. New Jersey, William Patterson says, we want a chance to have a plan that's closer to the Articles of Confederation. But interestingly, and anybody who's ever been to a meeting, if you know anything about agenda setting, or if you've ever been to a meeting, a lot of times if somebody comes with a prepared plan, even if nobody else knew about it, that's going to set the original tenor. And if you debate it for 2 weeks before you offer an alternative, by that time you're probably convinced, okay, I don't see anything wrong with having 3 branches instead of 1.
Right.
Who cares whether it's bicameral or unicameral? What the small states cared about was their loss of power in Congress, because whereas they would have been represented equally into the Articles and at the convention, now they're being asked, both houses of Congress, let them be represented according to population. And, Virginia was 3 or 4 times, maybe more so, larger than many of the other states there. And, there were a couple large. Pennsylvania was fairly large. Massachusetts, I don't think New York was anywhere near the current population. But in any event, when Patterson introduced the New Jersey plan, they wanted to go back to equal representation. And as you know, the convention has been called a series of compromises. And the most famous and disputed today is the Connecticut Compromise, where, the most undemocratic part of our Constitution is that each state has 2 votes in the Senate, regardless of its population. And so I believe it's something like if you're in Wyoming, your vote is worth 70 times more, toward a member of the Senate than it would be if you were in California.
Right. California or New York. It's
right. Or any of Texas and any of those large states. So, eventually, and then of course the other primary, well, I don't know if it was a primary. Well, another major compromise had to do with how you would elect the president. This was a panel that I served on earlier this week. Today people don't understand. They think it was a conflict between popular vote and something else. No, there were some delegates, including James Wilson of Pennsylvania, who favored a national popular vote, but it really wasn't practical at that time. Communications, transportation was so different than it is today. So the primary way that most nations at the time, most semi-democratic nations, was a parliamentary system where Parliament would choose, whatever the majority party or faction in Parliament would be, they would choose your chief executive would be their leader. But that conflicted with Mr. Montesquieu and with other advocates of separation of powers, which was if your president is chosen, particularly if he's subject to re-election, if he's chosen by Congress, he's going to be beholden to Congress.
Oh, interesting.
He who pays the piper calls the tune. And so the Electoral College was this elaborate mechanism designed, so it basically gave something to everybody, but it was designed to provide an indirect method of election. And then, a third compromise, which in some ways was the saddest in terms of its longer term consequence, was the compromise basically to leave slavery alone, to permit continued importation for 20 more years, and then to give slave states, which obviously were never going to enfranchise African Americans voluntarily, to give them credit for 3/5 of a person for every slave that was in the state.
Right.
And so this over in early American history, this overrepresented the southern states. So if you look at the first, well, 6 presidents, 4 of them are Virginians. And the most pivotal election probably at that time was the election of 1800, where Mr. Jefferson defeats Mr. Adams through the Electoral College, but that's partly a result of the 3/5 clause. If Virginia and the southern states hadn't been given credit for their slaves, which they did not enfranchise,
and even though they weren't voting,
that's right.
Wow.
So it's hard to put a lipstick on that pig. I mean, that it was what it was. Oh, I will say, there's been a large discussion. Was the Constitution a slave document? Well, the Constitution left slavery where it was. It didn't seek to expand it. And the fact that it didn't use the word is suggestive that the delegates were very uncomfortable with the institution. And particularly, by 1820, 1830, you have all kinds of Southerners arguing that slavery was a positive good. It's good obviously for the white planters, but it's also good for the slaves because they don't, they're not capable of ruling themselves.
Right.
Of course, which is poppycock. But nonetheless, in 1789, you don't find those arguments. You find people like Mr. Jefferson, who's the slave owner, saying slavery is like having a fox by the ears. Once you grab him, what do? If you let him go, he's going to bite you. We're stuck with it. We got to make the most of it. We sort of hold our nose. Let's not talk about it in polite company. Right. We're included in the Constitution, but realistically, particularly South Carolina and Georgia, made it clear that if you take any measures against slavery here, we're not going to continue as part of this, new government.
Interesting. Well, let me ask you another question then. In talking about the Connecticut Compromise and your explanation and example, let me say what I think that I heard and then see if I can twist it for today. Okay. So what I think that I heard you explaining is part of the reason that we came up with or agreed to the electoral process rather than just a straight popular vote was the issue of communication and travel, that it was harder to do that. So it seems that it would have been easier for the states to hold their own and collect their own ballots then and then send their representative. Is that what I'm hearing?
Yes. Now, okay. Well, and what you're hearing, so the Connecticut Compromise dealt specifically with representation in Congress.
Okay.
When the Electoral College was subsequently devised, it used the mechanism. So each state has a number of electors based on the total number of members of the House of Representatives, which is based on population, and it's 2 senators. So it gives an element of federalism to the Electoral College, and its defenders think that this is still important. When we vote for the presidency, we're not simply voting as one mass, although we largely do it on the same day, but we are also voting as citizens of individual states. And particularly, if you're from Wyoming or Idaho or, some of these particularly smaller rural states, we ought to get some representation just because we're states. And, for better or worse, that's embodied within the Electoral College. It's of a secondary compromise.
Then is it time for change where if we take away the communication problems that we had with, we're hardly doing horse and buggy. It takes how many weeks to travel from a largely southern state to a northern state. They had to travel to the convention and stay there and come back. So since
right, you don't actually travel to D.C. You travel. The delegates would assemble within their states.
Right.
Then they would submit, presumably through the post office or Pony Express.
Right. But the convention, they had to travel and stay at the convention, correct?
Well, it's not a convention. I mean, they meet together on a one-time basis after each election, and it's always a different group of electors each time.
Oh, no. I mean the original constitutional convention.
Okay, it never served as an electoral college.
Yeah, we're talking in contrary purposes, where I'm basically saying the people who went to the Constitutional Convention.
Right, they they had the same kind of travel issues and transportation.
They wouldn't show up for a week and go back home and then come back the next Monday.
Right. That's right.
If we take away the travel issues and the communications issues that we used to have, is it better, or would the founders have adopted the full vote by popular vote?
It's hard to say. I mean, part of what's happening here, those who favor federalism, some of them still support the Electoral College because it does give some representation, a little bit larger representation to those smaller states. There are some parts of the Electoral College, though, that have drastically altered by constitutional amendments. So the 12th Amendment, after a debacle in the election of 1800, after all the delegates who voted for Jefferson also voted for Burr, they said, well, we're going to make it, because each elector was supposed to cast 2 votes, and whoever got the higher votes would be president, assuming it was a majority, et cetera. And so they, in 12th Amendment, subsequently decided you'd cast a separate vote for president and vice president. And then the 23rd Amendment, I believe it was, later provided that we'll give 3 electoral votes to the District of Columbia.
Okay.
But far more important than that is, I think the way the founders originally conceived of the Electoral College was that, you know, your viewers would elect people like me, right? Who presumably know a little bit about the Constitution, or maybe not so much like me. You know, they would elect people that were leaders, political leaders within their state, that they thought would be able to exercise judgment. And remember, part of it is, you know, people from, I probably know more about many senators out of the state than I do my own governor.
Oh, huh.
And, you know, because you think of, you know, who's on the national news? Well, it's not usually the governor. You know, even in the state news, often national issues are more. So originally it was thought we will elect wise people who will be more from me. You know, they've been in national assemblies. They'll know these people better than we do. That quickly disappeared. It quickly became, you know, do you support Jeffersonian Republicans? Will you pledge that you will vote for Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr? Yes. Okay, you're going to be an elector. Well, today, when you cast a vote for president, you're voting for a group of electors who are pledged to vote for that candidate. And if they exercise independent judgment in many states, they can be somebody can substitute in their place, or they can be fined for being a so-called faithless elector. But the other very consequential decision that has been made is all but 2 states, Nebraska and Maine, use a winner-take-all system. So if you win 51% of the vote in Tennessee, you get all of Tennessee's electoral votes, or Maryland, or whatever the state is. And so you could win a large state by a single vote and pick up 40 electoral votes, and, you know, lose another state. The consequence is you can win the national election, popular vote, as Al Gore did in 2000, as Hillary Clinton did in 2016, and still lose the electoral vote. And frankly, in some ways, the sad thing about one reason you're never going to get an where it's very difficult to get an electoral college change is one party now clearly sees that it has been advantaged somewhat, at least most recently, by an electoral college. It's almost a shame that one of those elections didn't go the other way, you know, where one would be, well, a Republican got it this time and a Democrat got it this time. But it's, you know, amending process, as we know, is very difficult. You know, 2/3 of both houses of Congress, 3/4 of the states, and people are looking more toward electoral advantage than they are to abstract matters of, you know, democratic theory.
Well, with the winner take all system, is that put into the Constitution? Then how did they come up with that?
Well, it's not in other words, each state determined how they were going to do their votes. So, and I don't know. I think some states actually might profit from dividing their, you know, one of the problems with the Electoral College, or not, I mean, it depends on your view, but one of the issues with the Electoral College is, you know, all you have to do is amass, seems easy, right? 270 out of 538 votes. And if you know, I mean, frankly, if you're running for president and you're a Democrat, God bless you if you come to Tennessee. We're in the middle of a huge media market, so you might be able to get some media attention in surrounding states. But, you know, even if you have 666 on your forehead, if you're a Republican, you're going to probably win the election in Tennessee. So there's not a lot of incentive. And the same is true, by the way, for many, you know, if you're a Republican if you want to cause the Democrats to spend a little bit more money in California, you might make a trip or two there. Maybe you can have a fundraiser there, but you're not going to get California's votes. And so most election, we can, already look at look at what was in contention last time. Georgia, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Arizona, New Mexico. There are about 7 to 10 states that are truly contested states. And by the way, this is aggravated by, now not for the Electoral College, but this phenomenon is aggravated in Congress by gerrymandering, because most people who are running for election and re-election in Congress are running from basically areas where one party dominates significantly enough that if you can get that R or you can get that D by your name, you're going to win or lose the election accordingly. It's not foreordained, but it might as well be. So we have, in some ways, I think that's a much greater problem in many states right now, partisan gerrymandering particularly, where a leading party might have 55% of the representation in an existing legislature, that they're going to draw the boundaries so they increase that potential in terms of outlook to 70 to 80%.
Right. And
so you don't, and this is one of the reasons that we have such a dysfunctional Congress right now. If you're in a district that, every 2 years there's a close contest between Democrats and Republicans, you're far more likely to try to appeal across the aisle than to say, and frankly, Republicans, and this is probably true, lesser true of Democrats, but it's true of both. But if you're a Republican, you might be far more concerned that you will be outflanked by another Republican on your right than you are about being defeated in the general election by a Democrat. And to some extent, this is true in the Democrats as well. They don't want to necessarily be outflanked because voters in both parties tend to be more extreme. So your true gospel people are the people who vote up for the primary election. And interestingly, one of the first lectures that I remember from a political science course at William and Mary back in 1970, I believe it was, when I first had a course in it, was someone who got up and challenged the primary system. And I thought, well, that's ridiculous. Primaries, this is a progressive, but his argument was a good one. So few people show up at the primaries that the people who show up tend to be the people on the extremes. And they are driving, I think they're driving us into the ground, frankly, both sides. But this is one of the reasons that our current Congress and current political system is I think, in utter disarray.
Interesting. All right. So with that, they did not have the party system as we know it.
That's right.
But how did different parties that they did have affect the actual voting? Because it sounds like not everybody actually agreed on it.
Well, okay. Talk about two different things. At the convention, the deliberations were secret.
Oh.
And that was highly, and could you have it? This is one of the problems. I've also written a book on, the so-called Article 5 convention mechanism. Could we have a convention today?
Where the states call it.
Right. And one thing I would say, I think it would be almost impossible to have one today without leaking. And I mean, there have been some proposals even that you take a group, you drop them in the middle of Montana someplace and cut off the only phone line.
they'll quickly figure it out.
Yeah, let them deliberate. But you would have reporters parachuting in and people trekking through the wilderness to get there. So at the convention itself, I don't think parties were an issue. Now, what happened is at the end of the convention, the delegates, and by the way, they violated, or they bypassed, I guess would be fair, under the Articles of Confederation, amendments had to be adopted unanimously. And that, by the way, was another flaw in the articles. People could see that it wasn't working, but there were a couple occasions where you get 11 or 12 states, and then the 12th and 13th, or the 13th would refuse to go by it. But what the delegates did is they decided that the new Constitution would go in effect among adopting states when I think it was nine out of the 13 had to agree to it before it went into effect. And so what happened is the country did divide into two different groups. Your Federalists, and we talked about the Federalist Papers earlier, your Federalists advocated support for the new Constitution. The Anti-Federalists were opposed to it.
Clever name.
And it was a very close contest in many states. The Federalists ultimately prevailed. Now, they did not initially get all 13 states. It took a while for North Carolina, if I remember, had 3 different conventions before they finally ratified. Rhode Island ratified even later than North Carolina. So we actually had a time where we didn't have a full 13 states under the new Constitution. But then what happened in Washington's administration, which began in 1789, Hamilton's proposal for a national bank divided delegates divided the nation among those who said, yes, this is an implied power of Congress, and those who said, no, the whole purpose of a written constitution is to nail everything down. It's not specified there. So that was sort of the beginning of the two-party system, which has, Federalists died out and replaced by the Whigs. Whigs died out and were replaced by the Republican Party. And frankly, I would not want to venture right now what the next 20 years will look like in terms of, it wouldn't surprise me to have a third party that could possibly, but I think either of the two major parties have enough divisions within them that they could split. So
to create more parties or different parties.
Yeah, and again, one of the reasons that some people like the Electoral College system is that they believe that it enhances a two-party system as opposed to in other words, that prize of the presidency means you want to have as broad a coalition as you can. Mm-hmm. And if we had 4 or 5 different parties, you might have a lot more elections going to be. By the way, if nobody gets 278 votes, it goes to the House of Representatives. And here's what most people don't know. They choose among the top 3 candidates, but they vote by states. Oh. And this, by the way, is one of, if you remember back to, obviously you do, the 2020 election, one of the hopes was you could tie up enough states at January 6th where nobody could claim a majority. And then when it went to the House, I believe the breakdown, I could be wrong, but I believe it was like 26-24. There were more Republican-dominated states than there were Democratic states. And if each state voted according to their party, it would have resulted in Trump. And, this is it's very fascinating. Trump has not in 2 elections gotten a popular vote majority either time. Clinton had more in 2016 and Biden more than 2020. The Electoral College worked to his favor in the 2016 election. And he was hoping if he could bring it back to the House, that it too would work in his favor.
Okay. Wow. So let me, with that, since we're about at that hour for our program, let me run us to the amendments, because I remember you saying that there were at least, or was at least one, maybe 2 who were holding out because they didn't want to sign without amendment. So how did that come about, and when did we get the amendments?
Right. Well, first 10 amendments, which we today call the Bill of Rights, were adopted basically in response to anti-federalist critiques that, if we ought to have more explicit guarantees. What if Congress tries to establish a national religion? Well, the Federalists said, well, they have no power to do that. Don't worry about it.
Right. Of course they don't.
Congress wants to suppress freedom of speech. Congress doesn't have any power.
It's not in there.
The Federalists say that's not good enough. We want 10 commandments, or, we want something there in writing. You
caught me there.
Right. We want something in writing, and that's what they got. And, to the extent, this does show, it shows that no matter how good something is, it's rare that it can't be improved by discussion and debate. And most people think that it was a mistake. Now, I should tell you, in the first 125 years, Bill of Rights made almost no difference at all. You'll go far and wide to find a court decision based on the Bill of Rights, partly because it initially only applied to the national government.
Oh, right. And then it was later applied to the states.
But I think in retrospect, most of us are glad that we have a provision for free exercise of religion, freedom of speech, that sort of thing.
Yeah, as an attorney, I really like those 4th through 6th amendments.
Yes, you do.
Those are kind of my favorites.
Yes, I get it.
I've argued them many times in court. Quite fond of the little things.
Yes.
So, but when was the Bill of Rights ratified in comparison to the original Constitution?
Right. It was the first Congress, James Madison's, who had not originally supported the Bill of Rights, but had, when he was elected to Congress, had said, it can't do any harm. If this is what we need to get the Constitution adopted, I will support it. He introduced it in 1789 in the first Congress. First Congress did vote for it, although he had to, it took him a while to convince people that this was more important than setting up the Treasury Department and other issues. It was ratified in 1791.
Okay.
So, and then
a little later.
A little later, but not, again, given the transportation and communication of the day, that's relatively quick ratification.
But so that was 1789.
Well, that's when the Constitution goes into effect. 1791, the Bill of Rights is adopted. December 15th, maybe somewhere along in there.
Right. So the Constitution was 1789.
It's when it goes into effect.
Correct.
It's signed in 1787, yes.
So it went into effect in 89. The Bill of Rights was 91. And that was the first 10 all in one clump. Yes,
there were 12 originally proposed. 10 were adopted. One subsequently was adopted 200 years later as the 27th Amendment.
And so for our listeners, again, this seems like it's been so long ago that we studied these topics. And frankly, now I don't know how many people are actually taught this. But how many amendments do we have? 27. So in over 200 years, we've only had 27 amendments, and 10 of them were all at once.
10 were at once. 13th through 15th were adopted from 1865 to 1870. The 16th through 20th, or 16th through 19th were adopted from like 1913 to 1919. So they tend to come in clumps. And
when was the last time we ratified one?
Hold on.
Please tell us.
I'm going to have to punt on that one. The 27th Amendment is that odd one. It's the one that was proposed as part of the Bill of Rights and was adopted maybe, I want to say 1991-ish, but I bet I'm wrong.
It's been a hot minute.
Yeah. Anyway, well, let's see. Amendments through 27. Well, I was a year off, 1992.
Okay.
And the one before that, 1971. And that was giving 26-year-olds the right to vote.
Wow.
I'm sorry, giving 18-year-olds the right to vote.
26-year-olds. Amendments. That's amendment. Okay. Well, is there anything, as we wrap up here, is there anything else about the creation of the Constitution or the convention that to you stands out the most as something you hold on to, whether it's something funny, something wise, something interesting, something to take forward?
Yeah. I mean, I think I think it gives some hope that people can, in times of crisis, and maybe it was good that it wasn't such an immediate crisis that that's all people could think about. But at a time of governmental dysfunction, that people who still believed in the ideas of rationality were able to get together, realize that nobody was going to get everything that they wanted, but that it was possible to form a more perfect union, and they accomplished that.
Well, may we all continue to strive toward that more perfect union. Yes. And thank you for joining us. And you can everybody can check out the list, or at least a larger list of Dr. Vile's books and publications on the website for the Honors College. We're going to drop that down in the links and descriptions that we have. Don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel. It's Through the Law Unscripted is our main channel, and this is the Weekly Wine Podcast. So like and look at and subscribe to both so you can continue to be notified when we're up next, and can follow us and encourage others to follow us too. We also have a link. We have an affiliate link with Quimby Bar Review. So law students, I know the current time that we're doing this in September for Constitution Week isn't quite on your radar as far as the July and the February bars, but don't forget they're coming up. We do have a link that will give you 10% off. And the Law Unscripted itself offers some bar supplement programs as well as law school exam programs and some mock trial hopefully coming soon. So thank you all for joining us. Dr. Vile, thank you again.
You're welcome.
And we will catch you next time on the Legal Weekly Wine.